What's up, everybody, and welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 23. I am Kyle Anslone, and I'm joined by the co host, Will Porter. Will, how's it going today?
Kyle, how are you doing this evening?
Pretty good. Got a full list of stuff to talk about today and some really important stories in here. And so, just real quick before we get rolling on it, to remind everybody to subscribe to the new show somewhere if you're potentially still listening on any of the old foreign policy focus feeds. Everything should be switched over to conflicts of interest now. So go ahead and try to search up the conflicts of interest if you're still listening on the foreign policy focus feeds. And then if you haven't already, subscribe to the YouTube channel. We're adding new subscribers there every day. And it's a video version of the show that adds, I think, an awful lot to it. It makes it a really cool experience. So be sure to check out the show on YouTube if you haven't yet. And with that, let's get into the show today, Will.
Let us do it.
First story today. Top 50 U.S. think tanks receive over $1 billion from government and defense contractors. This was a new study. I have it written up here by Barbara Boland at the American Conservative. She did a great job writing up this story. And some of the highlights that she has is this study that was ranked by the University of Pennsylvania found that $1 billion went either from the U.S. government directly or through the intermediary of one of the defense contractors, and then ends up going to the think tanks who write the different policy position papers and everything like that that politicians use to make our defense policy. And so somebody from Rand or the Center from New American Security, the New America Foundation, or we'll go over some others I'm sure on today's show, all are receiving millions and millions of dollars from either the government or these companies, and then they turn around, defense contractors, and then they turn around and they produce studies that say, oh, we need more war, we need more tanks, we need more F-35s, or whatever the hell it is. And so, Will, what did you think of this story?
Yeah, I thought this was a great. Barbara Boland did a great job writing this thing up, and I think it's based on like a combination of different data, like that use some of the data from the University of Pennsylvania, and then also I think the actual like organization that did the report was the Center for International Policy. So they brought together quite a few different data sets here. But yeah, as you're saying, they looked at the top 50 U.S. think tanks and found, surprise, surprise, that they're heavily funded by the U.S. government and the broader military-industrial complex, to the tune of something like $1 billion over 5 years. Between 2014 and 2019, I think is when this report looks at. I'm not totally sure why they picked those dates, but I got the idea that was just like some of the most recent and best data that they had, which I believe they're mostly deriving from like the think tank's own self-reported financial records. So that's good to keep in mind that that's a lot of what this is based on. But the organizations to get the most money, you named a few of them there, were like Rand Corp, the Center for New American Security, or CNAS, which is like the liberal hawk version of the neocons PNAC, or the Project for a New American Century, very reliably hawkish organization there, as well as the New America Foundation, which I think just goes by New America nowadays. And their current president is Anne Marie Slaughter, which, if people are familiar with like some of the interventionists in the Obama administration, she was one of them. I think she had a job in the State Department, and she was, for every single disastrous intervention during that administration, Libya and Syria being the two main ones. So like the top three think tanks, I think, do give you a good idea of who's getting all this money from arms dealers and the government itself. It is, sort of, as you said, precisely the organizations that are going to churn out reports and papers saying how absolutely necessary it is for the U.S. military to be, occupying the planet, and for us to be slapping sanctions on everybody. So it makes sense to me why they would be getting these piles of cash. They are the ones that reliably serve the U.S. foreign policy agenda, of the U.S. empire, or what we call the blob. And this $1 billion they're looking at, I think it was handed out in the form of 600 separate donations. So it's kind of spread out from around 70 different sources, whether those were private military contractors or actual government agencies. In terms of the arms dealers, the names that are pretty much the ones you would expect, the top donors are Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and also Airbus, who they build warplanes, I think. So we have all the usual suspects in terms of the arms dealers, and then with the government agencies, it's, again, as you'd sort of expect, it's the Pentagon as a whole, it's various individual branches of the military, so like the Air Force and the Army, as well as like the DHS and the State Department. So those are like the primary government donors. The Rand Corp actually got the vast majority of this money that they're looking at between 2014 and 2019. I think they actually got over $1 billion themselves. So that was like the lion's share of this billion they're talking about. Whereas like CNAS and New America and there's another institution, the Atlantic Council, is also pretty high on the list. That's like NATO's think tank. They all got like around like $8 million. So that's like vastly lower than what Rand got. And I think it's because Rand, like unlike these other think tanks, the Rand Corp works on a lot of issues that go beyond policy alone, like doing like real scientific research and stuff on things like weapon systems and artificial intelligence and computing and a huge range of stuff. So I guess it kind of makes sense why they would have got the most money. But I guess just the last thing I'll say, like I think some of our listeners will recognize some of the other names of these think tanks that are high on the list. You had the Council on Foreign Relations. I think everyone's pretty familiar with them. The German Marshall Fund, the Brookings Institution, the Heritage Foundation, which is like a conservative thing, and then also the Center for Strategic and International Studies, which is it's another one of these like highly prestigious Beltway think tank that's been around forever. It's another one of these things that reliably pushes the U.S. foreign policy agenda. And that last one, CSIS, they're heavily funded also by foreign backers, by like the UAE and Gulf monarchies and stuff. And I think the same organization, the Center for International Policy, they've also got a report out on like foreign backers of our U.S. think tanks. And so there's all kinds of like, dodgy stuff going on behind the scenes, I think, with the funding of these think tanks, which are very influential in sort of shaping policy and public opinion.
Yeah, one of the reasons I really want to talk about this story, Will, is because, when you look at things that happen, especially in Washington, D.C., and when something happens in like foreign policy news will come up, like the time 4 U.S. soldiers were killed in Niger. Even somebody who is a foreign policy hawk and I think is kind of known for having a little bit more foreign policy prowess, Lindsey Graham, was unaware that the U.S. had soldiers stationed in Niger. And so, if Lindsey Graham even doesn't know kind of where all U.S. soldiers are stationed in Africa, there's probably not a senator who does.
Right.
Potentially like Rand Paul or Mike Lee or Chris Murphy or somebody are people with a little bit more interest, but generally, if you've ever listened to committee hearings with like members of the House or senators and they talk about foreign policy, it's pretty clear that they are not very informed. They might be able to talk about healthcare policy and Obamacare pretty well. But when it comes to, explaining like what, legal authorization the U.S. is using to carry out increasing, military strikes in Somalia, many of them may be unaware that there's an increase in number of military strikes even going on in Somalia to begin with. And so, these reports are even more important because it's like I feel like kind of the mainstream media for the political class here.
Right.
It's like you see like a lot of Lockheed Martin or Raytheon commercials when you watch Fox News or any of these MSM channels, right? And so you have to imagine that they produce content that's like kind of friendly to these organizations and pro their war loving message. And that I think the same kind of thing happens here where you get the donations from the weapons makers and then these people produce reports and these reports are just critical to Washington D.C. again, and trying to explain here because the congressmen really don't have a whole lot of their own personal information on what's going on in the Middle East. And so when CNAS or whoever else writes up a report that says, oh, this dictator must be kicked over or else the Middle East will, erupt in flames and it's going to be awful. Well, they have no other information to dispute that. And, this is a tank. And so that's the real catch that they kind of use. And it just seems like everybody kind of buys it and laps it up. And of course it is used a little bit for the general public too. They do, them, produce these reports on, Fox News or CNN and have whatever former intelligence or military official on there to say, oh yeah, they're absolutely right about this, and if we don't follow this exact policy prescription and buy 100 more tanks and 100 more planes and 3 aircraft carriers, well then, I mean, China's gonna be invading and oof, you don't want to be an American because you're gonna be speaking Mandarin by, 2023 or something if we don't get this done. And it works obviously because they're getting millions and millions of dollars. They're a part of this huge like money laundering scheme here where they take our tax dollars and give a little bit to everybody else on the way, and then they say, hey, look, we got some health care for you that's kind of crappy on the other end or something like that. So what, I don't know, Will, anything on that part of it?
Yeah, I mean, like they're massively influential. Like you're saying, like a lot of government officials do rely on them when they're crafting policy. They'll cite these reports and stuff. But it also just permeates, I think, through like the mainstream media. A lot of these like think tankers in the Beltway are they're the go-to sources for a lot of journalists there who like they need some mucky muck expert to comment on Syria or whatever. They go straight to CNAS or one of these type of reliably establishment
Rand
think
is a
tanks.
big one for that.
Right, right. Yeah, they just have these sort of experts for hire. And it really turns into this huge racket, like self-licking ice cream cone kind of thing, where again the government's feet they're pouring money into these think tanks basically to produce reports of what they already want to hear, of the things they already want to do, and then they turn around and cite those reports to justify what they already wanted to do. So it's just this big racket, this big circular thing that it's no surprise to me that we see $1 billion being handed out, and I suspect there's probably more. This is just based on like the records that the think tanks themselves report, and some of their records are weird too, where they'll report things as a range. So like this contribution was between $25,000 and $100,000, which gives them like a lot of wiggle room to like round up or down. And so we might actually be talking about 2 or 3 or $4 billion here when if you really drill down to this stuff.
Yeah, I forget what agency I was looking at, but I was trying to figure out how much the Qatari government gave to one of these think tanks, and the range was 2,500 to $5 million was the donor level they were at. I was like, wow, that is a big difference.
Very
Um,
useful figure there.
yeah, right. And it is strange how they get away with being able to do this and take money from foreign governments and have the State Department pouring money to these organizations. And as we've seen more recently, or I guess most recently, with like the FDD, Foundation for the Defense of Democracy, where they've
Yeah.
received money and then they'll go and attack American citizens with fake propaganda. And so I believe Matt Blumenthal has been a target of this campaign where, they take money and then, yeah, just slander American citizens, with our kind of funding from our own tax dollars. I mean, I'm sure they're not like, oh, this is the particular $10 from Matt Blumenthal and we're giving it to FDD to, for them to go on Twitter and insult him. But that
Right.
is kind of how it all ends up playing out. And so, I feel particularly insulted in this whole thing because me and you are working so hard to try to give people a different narrative, and yet for every dollar we make and we have to pay a certain percentage in taxes, the government's going to take a certain percentage of that and give it to the people who are pushing the false narrative that we're trying to debunk, and that is just extremely
Yeah.
frustrating.
That is depressing, man. I never really thought of it like that. That like, they're taking the money that we earn trying to do this stuff and handing it to like the worst possible actors in the media realm. So, yeah, that's something else.
All right, well, let's move on. Talk about Bolivia here, where the party of Evo Morales, who was just probably about a year ago now, deposed as leader of Bolivia after the OAS, the Organization for American States, claimed that his election victory was invalid and based on some shady dealings, and or not shady dealings I guess, but election fraud, right? That turned out not to be true. There was a report, I think the Center for Economic Progress was the group that put out the first report, and then they had their results backed by MIT study, and
Yeah.
both of those came to the conclusion that no, Morales legitimately won the election. But of course, the way these coups go, when the military and the police told Morales to leave in the days after the election, Morales was forced to leave the country fearing for his life. Many of his supporters were also just some have said victims of state violence, and scores of them were killed. I'm not quite sure. I never see a good death toll here, but it seemed to like be in the tens or low hundreds. not like thousands and thousands of people were killed, but nonetheless, for this entire year, and this year of extreme, just kind of chaos with COVID going on and everything like that, Bolivia's leader has not been the elected candidate Evo Morales, but rather this random kind of senator who just happened to be in a somewhat powerful position. I believe her name is Janine Arnaz. And so they had pushed off elections for a while, and they finally had to happen. And then this socialist candidate, again from Morales's party, just came in and won the election, I think by a large margin. I think by like double the margin that Morales did. They had like a 20% margin of victory, or something crazy like that. And so, I mean, this seemed to me the Bolivian people called off the American coup in their country. Does that look about right to you?
Yeah, I mean that is sort of the takeaway that I took from this story. I mean, it's sort of a good update. Like the last time we covered the Bolivian politics, we did so after the current, soon to be former acting president, you mentioned her, Janine Áñez, dropped out of the race last month. That's the last time we talked about Bolivia. And at the time, we were explaining how she bailed out because the challenger from Evo Morales' party was surging in the polls. This guy Luis Arce. And back then in September, the poll numbers were suggesting he could maybe win the election without even having to do a runoff. Because in the Bolivian system, if you get more than 40% of the vote and you also have a 10-point lead over the runner-up, the guy in second place, you can win in the first round. Or obviously, if you get a clear majority, you can also win like that too. But if you get this thing where you have 40% of the vote and you're 10% ahead of the second place candidate, there's no need for a runoff. And according to the preliminary result for the election on Sunday, they just had their presidential race. According to the exit polls, that is precisely what happened. Like those earlier polls seem to have been verified or borne out, because the socialist guy Arce did apparently win on the first round, which is pretty significant because not only does Arce belong to Morales's party, the Movement for Socialism, but he's like a hand-picked successor to Morales. Like he knew him and like served under him, I think, as like a finance minister while Morales was president. So in the first presidential election since Morales was forced out of power, in what I think we can fairly call sort of a U.S.-backed coup, in that first presidential race, we have a Morales loyalist winning a pretty crushing victory over both the interim president, Janine Áñez, who had to drop out, but also winning over the runner-up in the last race, Carlos Mesa, who is himself, I think, a former president. And I think he came in second this time around as well. And so I don't think have like the official tally for the election yet. We just have the exit polls. But apparently both Áñez and Carlos Mesa have conceded defeat to Arce. So they're not disputing the result, at least not yet. But I think that might kind of say something that they've already admitted defeat before they even have like an official tally yet. If they were contesting the results, like I would start thinking this is looking like a repeat of last year. As you explained, there was sort of all these opposition protests. They claimed that the vote was not legit. And you had the OAS coming out and saying that there were indeed irregularities. And that basically justified Morales being forced out of power. The military ended up backing the opposition, and he like fled the country just for his own safety. Like I guess he didn't feel like he was even safe in Bolivia anymore. And yeah, you did mention like the state repression against his supporters. There has been quite a bit of government violence from the Áñez administration, but it does seem like this. I don't know all the details about Bolivia's election system. I don't know how much it really reflects public opinion, but this last election does at least seem to show. It seems to be a rebuke of Janine Áñez, who has been claiming to be the legitimate leader of Bolivia for the last year or so. And apparently Bolivians don't agree with that. They don't think that like this, Áñez is basically like a U.S. supported stooge. And so apparently they're not too fond to have her foisted upon them, because she didn't even make it till the actual election. She actually dropped out. As I said, that's what we covered last time. But this election nonetheless seems to be a rebuke toward both Áñez and Carlos Mesa.
Yeah, well, I definitely agree with that last part, that it seems to be a rebuke of that government and coup in removing Morales from power. They've had the advantage of being the government of Bolivia for a year now, and I guess operating under a lot of kind of emergency powers, as what happens when you come in under a coup and stuff like that. And also, this is throughout the coronavirus crisis, where every government around the world has seized a lot of emergency powers. And even with that, they weren't able to turn out a result that was even as good as the result against Morales. And so it did seem that just from the results, and I would assume that the government would have gotten a little bit better at election rigging, and so maybe the results would have been actually closer than the last election or something like that.
Right.
The overwhelming results for again Morales's party, I think is really revealing. And then I guess the other thing is, and I'm not sure if you have any information on this, is Morales now planning on returning to Bolivia? I mean, I'm assuming that they're not going to just like put him back in power or anything like that, but he did seem to be the figurehead of like his movement in his party, something like kind of Chavez was in Venezuela, and so I'm sure his presence there will help to kind of rally and keep that party in power.
Yeah, I'm not actually sure, but I was going to mention that I'm not sure what Morales plans to do next. I know he's still abroad, or I think he's still abroad, like sort of in like he has asylum somewhere, I think right now. But I'm not totally sure about what his plans are in terms of coming back to Bolivia. I do know that he like heavily advised the campaign of Luis Arce. So like he's been in close. He's not just like incommunicado or something. He's definitely been closely in contact with his party and with the guy who just won. And so it wouldn't be too surprising to me if he did, make plans to come back to Bolivia. But I'm not totally sure what the situation is in terms of his safety and stuff. Like, that was the reason why I think he left in the first place. So I guess that I think it will depend on that too.
Yeah, the last thing I'll just mention on this is, we're talking about the Bolivia Socialist Party here, and that's for the Bolivian people to decide. Me and Will are both libertarians, and obviously, I think it would be better for Bolivia if they had a complete free market, and in the long run, I think that'll turn out better. But it's important to remember that those aren't the two options here. As you point out, Janine Áñez, it was just like the right wing coup leader. She wasn't, a free marketeer or anything like that. And so the choice for the Bolivian people was, the party of their ousted leader who they liked. And, while Morales was a socialist, it seemed like, he was the kind of socialist that made the government run a little bit better. Whereas Bolivia's right wing is the kind of socialist that skims off more money from the top. And that's the right and left we're talking about. We're not talking about socialism versus freedom here. And I think that's a part of the reason why the Bolivians are so happy to have a socialist government is because anytime you have a different kind of government, they just steal more money or give it to the more elite class, whereas Morales's deal was giving the money to the poor people.
Right, right. Absolutely. That is often like the equation in Latin American politics. We're not usually talking about like a pure capitalist versus some kind of pure socialist. Oftentimes you're talking about somebody who's like more inclined to things like land reform or indigenous rights and stuff. That's usually the socialist side versus some of the more like cronyist parties that are like the right. It's not like conservatism or something. In the case of Anya's, I think she was kind of some kind of like theocrat. Like she blended her politics with religion quite a bit. So yeah, you're often not like these choices aren't so simple. You're not talking about capitalism versus socialism. It's often two very imperfect choices. And yeah, it does seem in Bolivia that people have chosen the socialist option. And again, I'm not, I don't endorse that necessarily, but in terms of limited options, like who am I to say like what they choose? And it's certainly not up to my government to say too. That's like, that's definitely my position.
All right, Will, do we have anything else on Bolivia?
No, I think that's about it. Thing I would tell people to look out for though is the actual official like election tally. We just have the exit polls right now, and they seem to be fairly reliable, but things could change if the official tally shows something different. So.
Right, and then I would assume that once the official tally's in, the coup government does have to give up power. And if there's something about a coup government, is they will do underhanded things to seize power. So I wouldn't be surprised if they try to find some way to remain in power. But Will, let's take a short break to tell people about our great sponsor, Paloma Verde CBD. And Will, how have the CBD products been working for you?
I've been really into it. Paloma Verde was so kind to let us both try a handful of their CBD products, and I've been a big fan. They have all kinds of stuff. They have liquid extracts if you're looking for like a heavier dose, as I often am. They've got fruit chews. They've got creams and salves. They have soft gels that come in all kinds of different formulations. Like there's one with curcumin for like joint inflammation and stuff. Another one with melatonin, which that's what I prefer for getting to sleep. They even have stuff for your pet. So they've got like a real wide variety of stuff of CBD products there. So if any of that sounds like it's down your alley, or even if you just want to learn about CBD and what it does and what it can do for you, visit palomaverdestore.com, PALOMAVERDE store.com, and use promo code PEACE to get 25% off of orders $75 or more. All right.
Thanks, Will. Let's get back to the show. All right, the next story we have up here is a real update for something we've talked about quite a bit, and that is the UN arms embargo for Iran. This is something that, the past month and a half that we've been doing the show has been a big topic for the U.S. government, as they've been doing everything they can to try to get the UN to extend the arms embargo against Iran, although coming up short. And so, Pompeo has just been resulting to threats and, saying that we'll sanction anybody who sells the arms to Iran, despite the fact that the actual UN embargo is ending. Well, the embargo has now officially ended, and Pompeo has restated his threats, and it's going to create a situation, I assume, where in the near future Russia or China will at least sign the preliminary parts of an arms deal with Iran. Not that they're going to have brand new Russian fighter planes by the end of the month, or S-400 missile systems. These deals often take a long time to get done, and so who knows when Iran would actually get any weapons. But the first headlines we'll start to see will, I'm sure, come out in the next again few months. Sometime by maybe 2021, we'll start to see Iran signing deals with Russia, potentially for like a S-400 missile system, or with China for their anti-ship missiles that they find very effective against like U.S. aircraft carriers and stuff like that. Yeah. So, Will, what do you think about this one?
Yeah, I mean, like, this is interesting. This embargo finally expired on Sunday, I think, after it being enforced for like 13 years. And after all that drama with the U.S. and their demands in the Security Council and the failed votes and their open threats and all this stuff, it looks like it happened pretty uneventfully. And like the only one really still complaining about this is the U.S. Like the rest of the world has pretty much accepted that this arms embargo has expired. And listeners may be familiar with this, but I think it's useful to run back over this. So the UN had slapped Iran with this embargo over a decade ago, but the nuclear deal that was signed between Iran and world powers back in 2015 had this provision that would sunset the embargo after 5 years, assuming that the deal held and everything. And that is what just happened on Sunday, that it finally embargo expired. However, the deal also had this. It also lifted a series of UN sanctions that were previously imposed on Iran. However, any of the signatories to the nuclear deal were allowed to request what's called a snapback of both the sanctions and the arms embargo if they found that Iran was non-compliant with the agreement, or they thought that they were. So the U.S. first tried to extend just the arms embargo part separately back in August in the UN Security Council, and they were trying to extend it basically in perpetuity, like just indefinitely into the future. But that failed. The council rejected that pretty overwhelmingly. I think you only had 2 member states voting for that, the U.S. being one of them, of course, the other one being the Dominican Republic. But it was after this attempt to extend the embargo, that Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, said he would then invoke the what's called the snapback mechanism of the nuclear deal. However, that also failed completely miserably. The Security Council refused to even put that up for a vote. They just left it on the table. I think 13 out of 15 member states just said nah, we're not really interested in this. Including all 5 other signatories to the nuclear deal itself, the UK and France and Germany and Russia and China. And they had been arguing that the U.S. already pulled itself out of the nuclear deal in 2018. It violated all of its terms by bringing back all of its own unilateral sanctions on Iran. So they said you can't just waltz back in and start arbitrarily invoking parts of the deal just to hit Iran with. And since then, the U.S. has kind of just been pouting and insisting that the snapback thing actually is in force. Without a UN vote, just because they say so, I guess. But like with an international sanctions regime and a international arms embargo, you kind of need other countries to participate. Otherwise, this is just like more unilateral U.S. action, which the U.S. has already done plenty of. So that's basically been the situation since that failed UN vote. The U.S. is just like pouting and screaming and crying and saying like, no, the embargo is on Iran, and we'll still say like they are threatening people with sanctions. Anyone who does any arms business with the Iranians. But I mean, it doesn't appear that the U.S. did get its way here. I mean, there is no more embargo; it's gone, and the snapback sanctions are not in force according to like all the countries that matter. Um, and the big thing that, like you kind of hinted at this, but the big thing that Pompeo and U.S. officials have been going crazy over and sounding alarms about is the possibility that Iran will start buying like advanced weapon systems from Russia or China without that embargo in place. But first of all, I just think like it's a bit rich for the U.S. to be complaining about another country arming itself when Iran would be mostly arming itself as a means to defend itself from the U.S. Or maybe the Israelis, I guess, who are themselves bankrolled by the Americans, by American tax dollars, and supported in every way by U.S. policy. But it's like the U.S. is basically complaining that Iran wants weapons to protect itself from its own threats, from the U.S.'s own threats. Like how dare they do that? No country is allowed to defend itself from American aggression. The thing is, though, the Iranians claim they do not want to start buying weapons. They're maintaining that they would actually rather start selling them to other countries. And that is not, as far as like, I think the U.S. has threatened a sanction for them even selling weapons, but the big concern is that the Iranians would get some advanced, sophisticated weapon systems from our, dire adversaries, Russia and China. However, another thing too is that like these arms sales, like they may eventually happen. The Russians and Chinese may eventually decide they do want to sell weapons to Iran, but it's not totally clear that those would happen right away. Like the Russians all along, even when the embargo was enforced, they argued that the embargo did not cover defensive weapons. So the Russians actually already sold the Iranians their S-300 missile defense system back in, I think, 2015. And they could have tried to do that same thing with the S-400, make that same argument, but for whatever reason, they didn't. And so I don't know, maybe their whole equation kind of changed now that the embargo has expired, but it seems like there's some indication the Russians aren't super eager to start hawking a ton of weapons to Iran immediately, because they kind of had some opportunity to do that with some of their sophisticated missile defense systems, and they did not do that with the S-400. Then there's also the fact that the Iranians are having pretty like severe economic hardship, which itself might kind of put a limit on their capabilities to do a gigantic arms deal with Russia or China. Not to mention the U.S. sanctions that are already on them make it pretty hard for them to pay for anything overseas. Just like the financial transactions themselves are blocked. So like there are some obstacles, it seems, in front of any kind of major arms deals right away between Iran and other world powers. And of course, as I'm saying, the U.S. has also threatened additional sanctions for anyone who does buy or sell weapons from Iran. So there's that as well. So like it just seems like there are quite a few roadblocks up in front of Iran immediately getting like a huge arsenal of Russian weapons or something. It seems the U.S. has like very much overblown that concern.
Yeah. I mean, the two things that really stand out to me are one, just the failure of Trump's Iran policy that actually I'm going to talk about a little bit more, I think, in the next story. And then the other one that, of course, as you mentioned, Iran is struggling economically right now. As far as countries that have been, suffering from COVID, it seems that Iran is one of those that has like a perpetual like 150 to 200 people dying a day, which are some odd, statistics. If you look at the graphs for Iran, it's some different looking numbers. But it does represent a country that has struggled with COVID for months and months and months and shut down different aspects and places in their country and stuff like that. So that's been harmful. I also believe the next Iranian presidential election is coming up next year. And so, I'm guessing for all parties involved, if you're spending, millions, hundreds of millions or billions on weapons, from Russia or China or something like that, maybe that's not the like good electoral politics in Iran leading up to the election where people are struggling to eat. It may be that the Iranian people are looking for a government that's more likely to I think invest a little bit more in people than weapons or something like that at this time. And again, with leading up to a presidential election, politics are even more important than normal, and so it may push off any major Iranian weapons buys deeper into 2021 or who knows how far into the future. But Will, I gotta move on to the last story that we have here.
Sure.
And it's an important one, I think, even though it also kind of doesn't matter. And as a story, the headline here is from the American Conservative, written up by Kurt Mills. And Trump campaign feels cheated from his foreign policy debate. They've actually issued a complaint to whatever the Presidential Debate Commission about the topics for the debate. The topics listed are fighting COVID, American families, race in America, climate change, national security, and leadership. Um, but they leave off, foreign policy. I think one of the problems is traditionally the third debate is a foreign policy debate, or at least that's the main subject of that debate. And it hasn't happened at all. I'm guessing that, incumbents typically like the foreign policy debate because they have the ability to say to their opponent, well, I have all the latest intel and everything like that. And if the American people knew really what was going on, they would vote for me even harder because, I'm what's keeping them safe and stuff like that. And I'm sure Donald Trump would really play up that aspect. Of course, there's the issue with Ukraine that I think would likely come up a lot more in a foreign policy debate. But leaving Ukraine aside, and we could talk about that later. One of the things that Kurt Mills highlights in his article here, that the Trump campaign came up with, is actually they want to talk more about his Iran policy. Believing that the Trump is an Iran hawk is a popular position. That's something that they want to bring up, which was insane to me because I feel like Iran is Trump's biggest foreign policy failure. That's, I would think, the one topic he would want to avoid. I mean, you went over all the diplomatic efforts they made to keep, different sanctions, get snapback sanctions, the arms embargo, all that they tried to keep on Iran. And even our own allies rejected our proposals at the UN. And so, it seems that getting out of the deal was, the Iranian nuclear deal was a huge blunder. And the Trump administration, I'm not quite sure how they could really spin that or sell that as a success, but that does seem to have been their plan, I guess, if they went forward with a foreign policy debate. And so, I don't know, Will, what do you think about them not talking more about foreign policy during the debates? And I don't know if you have anything, if you thought, or I guess I'm hoping that Trump still brings up the Ukraine issue. But my initial thought when I read this headline was that maybe the debate commission is trying to duck that particular topic.
Yeah, that would not surprise me. I mean, they completely avoided it during that Biden town hall. Like, they didn't even mention it at all. Like, they didn't even give him a softball to just like hit out of the park and deny it or something. They just ignored it as if it's never happened. It's kind of ridiculous, like a 13th floor on an apartment or whatever. However, yeah, it's funny. I hadn't actually heard the part about Trump wanting to sell his whole Iran policy. That's kind of ridiculous, especially because his whole thing, though, his all along has been that like I'll be such a tough, big, mean, tough guy to Iran that they'll come back and sign a much better deal than Barack Obama got, and that's like completely miserably failed. It's like that's not going to happen by November. So I guess like his goal would just be to turn around and just try to sell like hawkishness for its own sake. That like look at how good we've been at punishing the evil Iranians or something. I guess that would be his sort of like his approach. But I guess he could still get into that. I know that his campaign manager, what's his name, Bill Stepien, I think, said that Trump does still intend to bring up the Hunter Biden stuff. So he very well may try to also get in, shoehorn in the Iran stuff as well. I'm not really surprised that they forewent foreign policy here. Like, I wouldn't have been surprised if they held like, 10 debates that are all on COVID and race relations. Seems like that's all they've talked about in any like campaign things, whether it's town halls or debates or whatever. So I mean, yeah, it's not that surprising, but I guess even if they were to talk about foreign policy, even if that were like a topic on the agenda, I wouldn't expect that much like substantial, debate or discussion. But it is just kind of like, it doesn't even warrant a moment of discussion, before the American people. It's only like I guess I was gonna say it's only the most expensive policy of the government, but since COVID, I guess that's kind of changed. Some of those relief bills have been sort of like the most costly things government's been doing. But nonetheless, these are some of the most costly and destructive policies that government implements ever, like foreign policies. And apparently, the American people don't even deserve to, hear a word about that during the debates. Just COVID and race relations, I guess, all day.
Yeah, I really think that last point you made is the most important one. That is, foreign policy is typically the most expensive policy, and it may not come out that way this year. Although with all the COVID bailout money that's ended up going to defense contractors, we actually may be able to argue that the defense budget stays bigger than even the COVID bailout budgets. I mean, like,
Right.
look, a lot of the bailouts end up going to companies like Boeing, and I guess they could say, oh, it's for our civilian end or something like that, but maybe they don't make the crappy 737 MAX B that flies right into the ground if they didn't spend so much money trying to, lobby Congress and basically get on the Pentagon, honeypot, and that seems to be their bigger business model these days. And and so yeah, I mean those bailouts, and then I think there was like $1 million or something that was supposed to go to defense contractors to make like masks and stuff like that, and they just bailed out different companies, just gave them money to make like engine parts, not masks or anything like that.
Yeah, we
um
covered that on the show, I think, right? The bailout money that just went to arms dealers.
yeah, I'm pretty sure that was on conflicts of interest. If not, it's in the foreign policy focus archive. But the last thing that you mentioned is the most important. That is, the American people really deserve to hear what the candidates feel on foreign policy, because it is $1 trillion a year part of the budget. It's the lives of young Americans who will be sent overseas to die in these pointless wars, or the lives of just random people throughout the Middle East or Asia or Africa who are going to be the subject of U.S. drone strikes and airstrikes, even if they're just a young kid on their way to school, or a bunch of Afghani tree nut farmers tired from a long day of work, kind of just hanging out and trying to relax a little bit and get blown up by a U.S. drone strike. That's what we're talking about here. And it's apparently not even worthy of a portion of a single debate. I guess there's only two debates this time, so that's supposed to change things up a little bit, but you would think that they would at least maybe hollow out like a half hour of one of the two debates to specifically talk about foreign policy, and at least ask the candidates, hey, if you're president in 2024, when you leave office, are U.S. troops going to be in Afghanistan? How many troops do you think will be in Afghanistan? Ask the same question for Iraq, Somalia, Yemen, etc. At least to have the candidates have publicly stated that their foreign policy position on this war is this. And that, I mean, that's just not going to happen. And you mentioned it could have happened also at the town hall, and it didn't happen there. So we're really running out of time and opportunities. And it just goes to show, I think that there really is like kind of a deep state or a blob in the U.S., and foreign policy really isn't up for debate. It's not something that's up for the ballot. It's not something that the American people get to decide on. It's set by the bureaucrats and the permanent deep state in Washington D.C., and then they then give money to their weapons makers who help funnel money to the think tanks, who put out
That's right.
reports that are on the mainstream media that say if we don't go to war, we're all dead. And that's kind of our situation right now, Will. And unfortunately, the American people aren't going to get to hear the two candidates to whatever ability they even have to speak on these issues. I guess the only thing that doesn't bother me about this is how high level of a talk would Biden and Trump even be able to have on Iran? And if 100 million Americans heard Trump and Biden talk about Iran, my guess is that most of them would end up more disinformed than actually informed about the situation. But anything else on this, Will?
Just I'll just agree with the last thing you said there. It might be the case, even if they did talk this stuff, it might actually do the public a disservice anyway. But it is just sort of the principle of it that they just like the debate commission doesn't even think it warrants a single segment. So it's not so much the fact that, oh, we would have gotten such a great erudite foreign policy, international relations discussion between these great scholars, Trump and Biden, but it's just the principle of it that I think is just like a real slap in the face.
Yeah. Yep. Definitely. Well, I think the last debate is coming up on Thursday, Will. So maybe our last show of the week will be a debate recap, or at least we'll spend a little bit of time talking about that on the next show. Although, unless Donald Trump brings up Ukraine or Iran just kind of out of nowhere, it doesn't seem like we're going to have a whole lot of foreign policy topics to discuss in the debate.
Well, I'll be transcribing the thing, so I won't miss it.
Oh, you're a brave man, Will. All right, everyone. If you want to check out all of Will's great work, I mean, he does write up stories at RT, and then he shares them out on his Twitter handle every morning. So follow him at the Will Porter. Check out my daily news roundup that I write for the Libertarian Institute at Kyle Anslone _. Check out the show on Twitter at con_interest. The show is hosted online at the Libertarian Institute, so you could go there for the show notes page. We have a Facebook page, Conflicts of Interest. Make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel, Conflicts of Interest, and check out the video version of the show. Last, you could donate to the show at patreon.com/conflicts of interest. Me and Will are working on, putting that together and getting it a little bit nicer. Didn't want to have a few more episodes under our belt before we start asking y'all to start sending us some money. But it's getting about to that time, and hopefully we'll put together some decent Patreon tiers that incentivize y'all to give us a little bit more money. But if you've been listening to this show and you've been thinking, hey, I'm going to throw those guys a few bucks for the good work they've been doing, you do that at Patreon for now, and hopefully we'll have some other avenues to donate us money soon. Will, anything I missed?
You got it all, man.
All right. Thanks, Will.
Thanks, Kyle. Bye, everybody.